Far from being quiet, the ocean is filled with a cacophony of animal noise that can even disrupt the sonic transmissions of submarines. Most of the din is made by a surprisingly insignificant creature, the pistol shrimp. By snapping its claws, it can not only make communication sounds, but something far deadlier. These shrimps are its prey. It deals a knockout blow from a distance by using its claw as a sonic weapon. First, its claw is cocked like a pistol, then fired. The effect is literally stunning. As the claw snaps shut, it fires a blast of bubbles. Incredibly, as the bubbles collapse, they momentarily reach the temperature of the sun. This implosion causes a shock wave that stuns.
Using just a half a watt of electricity. The factors that seem to contribute to these effects include using a large number of stainless plates close together, the plates rough to facilitate releasing the bubbles, driving the cell using square waves, pulsed DC at kilohertz frequencies, and constantly modifying frequency to optimize gas production. Moray King, who has published 3 seminal books on zero-point energy, recently put forth a scientific model in which he suggests that the excess energy being observed in these unusual electrolysis setups comes from zero-point energy by producing charged water gas clusters, which somehow achieve a self-organizing criticality that coherently activates and absorbs zero-point energy. The experimental setups are typically rather simple, which is leading to a proliferation of the number of people reproducing and working to improve the effect and its consistency to the point where it can be used to serve as a practical primary energy source, an energy generator that could operate anywhere there is water. Zero-point energy is everywhere in the universe. It is the foundation of the fabric of space. Other groups, such as exogen technologies, are using these processes to purify water. These energy sources could actually produce culinary water as a byproduct. The day of water power via zero-point energy is arriving. Welcome to the future.
And many more are forthcoming.
A car that runs on water instead of gasoline. Can it be true? Well, inventor Stanley Meyer made an announcement today in Colorado Springs. He says he's come up with a device that will hook up to any engine and allow it to run on good old H2O. News 13's Kurt Goff tonight on the possible impact of the water fuel cell.
Stanley Meyer says the answer to dependence on foreign oil lies all around us. In seawater, tap water, and rainwater. Any kind of H2O, he says, can power just about every type of engine. How? With the water fuel cell. It fits in the palm of his hand, but it could revolutionize the world.
You're talking about a pollution-free, totally new source of energy, the voltage disassociation of water.
The fuel cell converts water into a gas, hydrogen oxygen, which is released in the form of thermo-explosive energy.
So the water fuel injector simply replaces the spark plug. We hook it to a hydrogen computer system which regulates and meters the flow going into the injector. It processes the water in such a way to release its thermal explosive energy.
The man who invented an engine that can run on water says he's been offered $1 billion in cash by oil-producing countries to sell his patent. So far, he hasn't sold. Environmental specialist Jan Porter talked to the inventor, who thinks that the U.S. auto industry could produce cars that run on water now if they wanted to.
Our industrial base of the world is based on the utilization of
Stan Meyer has a car that runs on water, and that's drawing crowds at this year's Extraordinary Science Conference in Colorado Springs. Myers has developed what is called the water fuel cell injector. The injector breaks down the water molecule into hydrogen and oxygen, and the hydrogen is what powers the car.
Basically, all we do is replace the spark plug and replace it with the water fuel cell injectors you see right here. We simply feed ordinary non-processed water, or processed water in here, and as the water goes into the injector, it hits a very high pulse voltage frequency, which instantly converts it into thermal explosive energy, and as a result, we can run this car down the road on water.
Meyer's invention was introduced in Britain earlier this month, and now the Brits have followed him here.
We recently took a scientific delegation to witness Stan's work, to really evaluate it, and came back saying, this is one of the most important inventions of the century.
Machine on, Jimmy Klein fires up his hot new invention. His machine emits a flame that feels only slightly warm to the touch. But watch what happens when he touches anything else.
Instantaneously, I can burn a hole right down through the center of that
The flame instantly turns hotter than the surface of the sun. Heat so intense it takes only seconds to literally burn a hole through charcoal. 3 seconds turns a brass ball to glowing liquid metal. Tungsten lights up like a sparkler. Steel, lead, and other metal slices on contact. Yet the tip of the welder stays cool to the touch.
No other gas will do that.
Jimmy Klein uses an alternative fuel source once thought impossible. He says people still have trouble believing him when he reveals his liquid fuel.
Water. Take water, electricity, and we break it down through our very unique electrolysis process.
Klein has just patented his process of converting H2O to HHO, producing a gas that combines the atomic power of hydrogen with the chemical stability of water.
It turns right back to water. You see water running off of it.
Klein originally designed his water-burning engine for cutting metal. He thought his invention would replace volatile assembly in welding factories. And then one day, as he drove to his laboratory in Clearwater, he thought of another way to burn his HHO gas.
On a 100-mile trip, we use about 4 ounces of water.
Klein says his prototype 1994 Ford Escort can travel exclusively on water, though he currently has it ready to run as a water and gasoline hybrid.
Simply speaking, it could change the world by reducing our dependence on fossil fuels.
These are equivalent to our...
Pete Dominisi is helping Klein take his hydrogen technology patents from a 2-room office in Clearwater to consumer markets around the world.
You know what? Microsoft came out of nowhere, came out of the garage. Why not hydrogen technologies?
The duo is already in negotiations with one U.S. automaker and the U.S. government. Their plans have grown from basic welding with water to powering the entire world from the safest and cleanest fuel on Earth. Craig Patrick, Fox News.
Members of Congress recently invited Teddy Klein to Washington to demonstrate his technology. Now his company is currently developing a Hummer for the U.S. military that can run on both water and gasoline. So far, his water-powered engines have passed all performance safety inspections, so all systems appear to be go right now and gives new meaning to the term running water.
And nothing happened. Where are those cars? I think a lot of us are here because we were fans of Stanley Meyer, and the interesting thing is that Moray B King has been at this a lot longer than Stanley Meyer ever was. He's been lecturing in this field for the last 40 years. Meanwhile, I want to just share a little anecdote. In the 1980s, I interviewed a German physicist by the name of Wolfgang Ludwig. Has anybody ever heard of Wolfgang? Not even one person. Oh, there he is. One person at the back has heard of Wolfgang Ludwig. He did amazing work in the field of physics, working with energy and healing devices. But when he was a kid, his thesis work was done on the memory of water. And as we know, that's the basis for homeopathy and any number of other technologies, and what is going to be introduced in just a moment here. And he was saying that water could carry information by rearranging the clustering structure of its molecules in response to an energetic input. More recently, Masaru Emoto popularized this phenomena in photographing beautiful snowflake shapes along with other geometry in response to emotional input into water. Today we learned that water, when subjected to high voltage discharge, can produce another kind of geometric shape, a torus-shaped plasmoid, which can amazingly produce enough force to drive a piston. According to our next speaker, Moray B King, even hobbyists can now make this water cluster gas, and this gas can run a generator. It's out there. Anybody can do it. What does this mean for the future of our technology? Well, Moray's going to tell us, and he's already told us in some of his books, Tapping the Zero-Point Energy, Quest for Zero-Point Energy, the energy machine of T. Henry Moray. So let's welcome one of the pioneers in this field, Moray B King.
Thank you, Regina. I want to thank the staff for inviting me back to give a presentation. Unlimited energy right in front of our noses. Can you believe it? Yes. I didn't. I was a graduate student in electrical engineering, systems engineering. My professors I was friendly with them. They were quite proud of the way I worked. And then something abruptly happened. And I fell from the graces, the lofty towers of academia, down into the pit of kookdom. And what happened to me? It was something I read. Back when we had the oil crisis of 1974, I looked out of my window at my apartment in Philadelphia, and I saw the lines of cars to get gasoline. And just then, my roommate, who happened to be a student of general relativity, asked, "Have you seen this?" He brought me the big book by Meisner, Thorne, and Wheeler, Gravitation. And the last two chapters of the book were Wheeler's theories of geometric dynamics. It talked about virtually limitless energy embedded in the fabric of space, fluctuating at a very, very high rate with incredible energy densities. What's called the zero-point energy or the zero-point fluctuations. And I asked the question, can this become an energy source? So I went to my engineering professors, and they said, never heard of it. None of the engineering professors have heard of it. In fact, most engineers have not heard of it. It's not in their textbooks. And yet the physicists have discovered it. They work with it. And what I found is that we actually have it in our science. It's in our physics. And the engineers just don't know about it. So all we have to do is just learn what's actually there. So we can explain how to tap limitless energy from the zero-point energy. And we can get it using water, of all things. The simplest experiment. And the key to a simple experiment is to have massive replication. And by the time I'm done, you're going to see how to explain it with the standard theories of physics and see how simple the nature of the experiment is. And it's effectively cavitating the water in the popular electrolyzers. What's in common between a car that appears to run on water and an inert gas engine? It is this. Excuse me. An archive form, a micron-sized torus form. We're going to see this 4 times appearing in this talk, twice in water and twice in plasma. And when it appears in plasma, it makes vortex rings called plasmoids. It's like a slinky closing on itself. And they manifest anomalous force and anomalous energy, and it can occur in water gas clusters and inert gas clusters, and we can make it from the collapsing cavitation bubbles. The main ideas are that zero-point energy really exists. Self-organization can occur. When it does occur, it interacts with plasma. It tends to make these vortex rings called plasmoids. They exhibit both anomalous force and anomalous energy. They can cascade to produce larger ones. You can take an energetic matter torus and with an abrupt electrical discharge convert them to plasmoids with a high voltage pulse. And they can cluster. Clusters can form in both inert gas and in water. What this offers an opportunity to convert something extremely inefficient, the internal combustion engine, where you inject air and water and fuel, you ignite the fuel, the hot air causes the piston to expand, and you waste most of your energy as heat. You're typically 20–25% efficient. However, if we inject these energetic clusters into the internal combustion engine, give them a very abrupt voltage pulse, typically from a discharge capacitor, they make the plasmoids, they exhibit mutual repulsion, they exhibit anomalous force, and they drive the piston with a huge amount of energy, much greater than you would expect, and effectively we're getting it from the zero-point energy. It allows us to retrofit automobiles. That's the big advantage. We can work with the technology today. Every few years or so, there's someone claiming they have a car that runs on water. I like the one coming out of Pakistan. The physics professors jumped all over it. It violates the laws of thermodynamics, but I just love what the reporter said in response. Why all the whining about violating the laws of thermodynamics? What law in Pakistan has not been violated? We've got to bring that reporter as one of our prime speakers. You watched the Denny Klein video earlier. It showed, I like to show that because it showed Brown's gas and the anomalies of Brown's gas, but because we're short of time, we just have to keep moving. Very popular projects, these water electrolyzers. They're typically used as boosters. If you go to YouTube, just put in water fuel in the search engine, you find over 500,000 videos now. HHO games, very popular in Florida. They gather together in their big tent and the hobbyists show off what they have. Typically, the dry cells, they separate the plates by gaskets. Very typical. The Anton cell, we'll see later, is a very good cell, very, very tight gap. We'll see why that's important. You can also feed the water in from the bottom. We'll see why that's important. Sterling Allen made this summary video. The important thing about this video is the website. Every PowerPoint, every presentation I've given on this topic, including this talk, is available for download right now from this website. So you don't have to take notes. You'll get every slide. And all you have to do to get to this website is Google water fuel ZPE. ZPE stands for zero-point energy. The names of the gas, this comes from the electrolyzers. Brown's gas, HHO is a popular name, meaning atomic hydrogen and oxygen. It's what Yule Brown thought it was because he was trying to explain why the gas was so energetic. Hydroxy is a popular name, and the correct name in chemistry is oxyhydrogen. But there's a secondary gas. That's the theme of this talk. And it's basically coming from a charged water gas cluster. George Weissman calls it electrically expanded water. He's the one that discovered it first. Omasa gas, he's the furthest ahead on the proper protocol for making it. And Surt and Gourley recognized there's another gas there, so they named it after themselves, SG gas. Nearly everyone out on the web, nearly everyone, believes the energy is coming from hydrogen. But electrolysis cannot yield excess energy. It costs you more energy to break apart the water molecule than you'll ever get back by burning the hydrogen. So it basically violates thermodynamics. That path has actually lost the energy. In fact, in these electrolyzers, you really don't want hydrogen. You want something better. So what's the energy source? Well, we're going to see it's the zero-point energy. The zero-point energy, back in the 1700s, 1800s, the scientific community believed space was filled with this ether and the Earth would move relative to it. And it was a very simplistic model. It looked like it was static. And so when they did the Michelson and Morley experiment, they say, gee, if the Earth's going to move relative to it, we would see the ether wind. They didn't see it. It only ruled out one type of ether model. That's the static ether model. They didn't even rule out the drag model, where the ether gets dragged along. So the modern view of the vacuum energy and essentially the ether is fluctuations of electromagnetic field energy. It gives rise to the uncertainty principle, this underlying jitter to everything in quantum mechanics, and it gives rise to pair production. Electron-positron pairs can spontaneously be created from the vacuum, and then they instantly go away. Create, go away, create in this big turbulence. It's well discussed in the standard physics literature. This is a Physical Review, a conservative journal. It's considered the most prestigious journal in the United States, and they discuss zero-point energy in the journal. Can explain why all the quantum effects arise, why the hydrogen atom is stable. It can actually become an energy source without violating thermodynamics. That's a very important paper by Puthoff. It can give rise to gravity and inertia. It controls inertia. That means the fields coming from the zero-point energy can allow a system, propulsion mechanism to drag whatever is caught in the field as if it didn't have any mass, i.e. a flying saucer type propulsion where you can abruptly undergo hairpin turns without feeling distress from acceleration. So therefore, our physics actually has embedded in it the underlying principles to do flying saucer propulsion. My poor professors are rolling in their grave. So it's called the quantum foam. This is what they call this turbulence. Electrical flux enters and leaves our three-dimensional space in this chaotic fashion. It's more like a plasma, a turbulent plasma. These tiny holes where the flux enters are down at the Planck length, 10 to the minus 33rd centimeters. That's 20 orders of magnitude smaller than the elementary particles. Can self-organization occur in this? At first, the answer would be, no, that's chaos, that's random. Everything decays to randomness. How can that occur? Well, self-organization can occur under certain circumstances. In fact, Ilya Prigogine won the Nobel Prize in 1977 for identifying the circumstances under which a system may evolve from chaos to self-organization. And the system had to require three characteristics. It had to be nonlinear, far from equilibrium, and have an energy flux through it. And it turns out the zero-point energy does fulfill these characteristics under certain circumstances. In fact, the energy flux itself comes from a higher dimensional space. Imagine this slot called flatland slot is a plane, and that's our three-dimensional space. By the way, this comes from brain theory now. They all jumped on board, which is the derivation of string theory, and the word brain means membrane. Our three-dimensional space is just one of the many parallel universes. This activity is orthogonal to our three-dimensional space. That's why it appears things pop in and go away, pop in and go away. They're coming from a higher dimension. When the energy passes through, it's incoherent fluctuations. That's the background vacuum fluctuations. When there's a slight tilt to it as it comes through, we call it a polarized vacuum. And when there's vorticity to it, it undergoes, makes the elementary particles. It's as if this flux is the flow of the river, and the vortex is like the whirlpool. So the flow of the river maintains the whirlpool. We see the whirlpool as an elementary particle. And thus, if the zero-point energy flux gives rise to every elementary particle, that means it gives rise to all of existence. Other folks have jumped in on it. Brian Greene has written popular books on the nature of multi-dimension universes and the parallel brains. And the Hidden Reality is dedicated to that. And the physicists take this stuff seriously. The engineers think they're off their rockers. They don't believe it. I like Lisa Randall's book. She's a Harvard professor, and she talks about some of the problems they have in physics with the standard model and the other things. She's willing to air their issues, and all their issues come from the zero-point energy, because it looks like we have an infinity embedded within. It's like we have an infinity embedded within a point. And what's really happening is there's just another dimension that's not part of their models. That's why it appears to be infinite, but if they start modeling the other dimension orthogonally, they'll make more coherent models. I like Robert Lachman. He's a Nobel laureate. He is basically on the same idea. He says everything arises from collectives, self-organization from collectives, everything including the laws of physics themselves. And I really applaud it, because that's what's required to get self-organization to come from the vacuum to become both the elementary particles as well as a possible energy source when we take that energy into plasmoids. So basically, to cohere the zero-point energy, we work with Prigogine's principles. We work with a highly nonlinear system like a plasma. We abruptly drive it far from equilibrium using an abrupt pulse. And we maximize the zero-point energy using the ions as well as vortex forms. Now, typical electrons in a conductor are called the conduction band electrons. Its model is an electron cloud. And that electron cloud is essentially in thermodynamic equilibrium with the zero-point energy. And thus, we don't see that in our normal circuits. That's why in typical electrical circuits working with just electron conduction do not manifest excess energy. However, the nucleus of an atom, especially in a plasma, exhibits a strong field lines of vacuum polarization converging to it. So abrupt motion of the nuclei, this is why abrupt discharge in a plasma will activate the zero-point energy in a coherent way. So basically, if you have a surge, a very abrupt motion of ions, you can see how we bend that zero-point energy flux into our space, and the component that's aligned with the plane manifests as extra voltage in the system. You seem to have more voltage than you should have, and thus that voltage can be used to extract energy. They see it in experiments, in the collision experiments with ions. They call it exotic vacuum states. And the plasmas in the ion acoustic mode means we're oscillating the ions at acoustical frequencies. They also exhibit large energetic anomalies. Excuse me. The anomalies include large radiant energy spikes, runaway electrons, anomalous heating, and they typically take the form. They notice this even in the fusion experiments, the hot fusion experiments. They take the form of some type of plasmoid, some type of ball lightning shape, and they associate that with the anomalies and the energy. So they're seeing it. They're seeing it in the plasma experiments. They just can't say, "Oh my gosh, I'm getting extra energy." They would be banished. They said that. Then they'd be joining us. Typically, it's a force-free vortex. It's like a slinky closing on itself. It naturally stabilizes there, as long as you have symmetry to launch them. The plasmoids cohere in the form of an energetic torus. This is a common theme. You've seen this theme quite a bit. The Thrive video stressed this theme. A lot of people have had this vision that the torus form is key to extracting energy. We see it, Nassam Harriman uses a double torus form, and he shows how it can guide the flows on the planet or the sun. It's an archetype. It keeps reappearing over and over and over again. David LaPointe did the same thing. He makes these, with bowl-shaped magnets, he's able to make these torus fields and show how they, in his plasma experiments, create the same shapes that we see out with the Hubble telescope. You see the same shapes. He says these are the archetype form of guiding self-organization is the dual torus. Here's a paper, if you like math, that was sponsored by NASA. It was also speculating there might be a zero-point energy fluctuation coherence. Basically, pair production is these pairs spontaneously come out of the vacuum. That's an incredible self-organization event, right? To make these vortex rings, these elementary charges of that. And these two pairs are entangled, they're coupled to each other. And basically, this is just new this year. The physicists, Maldacena and Susskind, are suggesting entanglement can be modeled by a wormhole connecting the two pieces. And a good analogy for this is the follicosoliton. So if you can imagine that the plane of a swimming pool is like it represents our flatland slot that represents our three-dimensional universe. There's these counter-rotating vortices that can be made just by scraping a frisbee across the plane. And they're connected by a thin filament. And if you put an ink drop in one of the vortex, it goes in and outlines the filament. Robert Kine made a video. He really talks about it. The follicosoliton is a two-dimensional analogy to that. If we can play this video, please. Push this one. You have to push this one.
The play button on the right.
Play button on the right. Thank you.
It's a virtual particle.
There was the frisbee up the top. We scraped the frisbee along.
Yep. Oh, look at that. That spot completely disappeared when the dimple was superposed right over it. Oh, look at that. That's amazing. It looks like gravitational lensing effect. There goes one dimple, then the other, into the shadow. This will be a keeper. There's some interesting...
Okay, back to the slideshow. So there's an example of an analogy of something occurring in the plane where two separate things are actually coupled together. And that analogy is the point. That's how we get entanglement between electron-positron pairs. Even if they're separated in our three-dimensional space, they're still connected in the higher dimensional space. And if we connect in both directions, up and down, we can actually make a torus that's going orthogonal to the plane. And so thus we have a single entity that appears to be two separate things when looked at from our space, but are actually connected in the higher dimensional space. And this would be called the hypertorus. If you can play that video, this shows you how a hypertorus would rotate in a higher dimensional space, but when it's projected down to 3 space, we see it as an inside-out type rotation, where it goes inside out. Can you? Oh, we won't play it. Just trust me. It takes too long to. Oh, okay. He's getting better. So a higher dimensional rotation, when projected down to 3 space, appears to be inside out. As it goes, but it's actually rotating in a higher dimensional space. And this, by the way, was a criticism of Wheeler's theory at first, because he couldn't explain the complexity of elementary charge, because they know there was some type of double rotation going on, and they kind of just use it math of quantum mechanics to explain it. But in fact, you have to go to sophisticated models like this to actually explain what's going on, and the physics community hasn't quite caught up yet. But when they do, let's just call them a bunch of kooks. Turnabout's fair play. Right? So basically, this higher dimensional flux is orthorotated by the toroid. It's a hyperspatial type of rotation. And that's why we get more energy twisting into our space, and that's why these plasmoid forms yield excess energy. They're orthorotating. Right? Ortho means at right angles. The energy. So thus, we can take any matter torus that's somewhat in a high energy state, give it an abrupt electrical pulse, and boom, we take it in a plasmoid, and at the moment it's converted to a plasmoid, it's orthorotating some of that 0-point energy. So the key is to make those torus. With the experimental evidence, Ken Scholler is one of my heroes. He just passed away this year. He's worked with launching a very simple experiment that launches a micron size charge cluster, or one of these plasmoids at a micron size. He says from the sharp point, just give it a abrupt pulse from a capacitor, and he'll launch one of those ball lightning-like entities, and when it hits a conductor, it makes a crater. What's happening microscopically is a blow-up of the point. A liquid melt. The tip starts to undergo a liquid metal melt. There's a slight protuberance of liquid metal that goes into the ionized corona around the tip. And then the tip blows off, and at the instant it blows off, you can see the circulation symmetrically just naturally makes a torus. Makes a circular flow that makes the vortex rings. That's how they launch the plasmoids. The trouble is, when you work with a solid tip, you'll wear the tip right off. So what Ken does, he made like a fountain pen. He replenishes the tip with liquid metal. So he feeds liquid metal into his launcher, so he doesn't destroy the tip. It just gets replenished each time. So he's able to repeatedly launch these plasmoid forms. He called them electron volitum, stands for Latin for strong charge, EV. Later on, when he was convinced he had excess energy from the 0-point energy itself, he called them exotic vacuum objects, EVOs. They contain about 100 billion electrons, 100,000 ions. The charge-to-mass ratio is always in the form of the electron. It always seems to settle out at that particular value, no matter how big the entity is. It keeps fitting that charge-to-mass ratio. And they contain excessive energy. They can form up into chains into the plasma environment around them. He made positive ones. This is very important because it proves it's not a collection of positrons, because when they hit a metal plate and dissipate, he doesn't get the gamma rays that you would expect from electron-positron annihilation. He's gotten to the essence of what makes charge itself from the vacuum. This self-organized mode that ends up making charge from the clay of the vacuum fluctuations itself. I told him this is the most significant of his experimental finds because he's getting to the essence of self-organization from the vacuum itself. And once again, the charge to mass ratio is like the positron. He makes them in pairs, and they spiral around each other. When they hit the plate, they make a dual crater. He makes dark ones. They go dormant. And it looks like you can't see them anymore, but just another small pulse reactivates them. So we have energy storage in this high energy mode that can be reactivated to exhibit more energy. So you're kind of in a matter cluster mode at that high energy state, which can be reactivated. Keep that in mind when we talk about the water clusters. So basically here are the anomalies. They like to adhere to dielectrics. They bore holes in high melting point ceramics. And here's the important point. When they do so, it's not from heat. It's like it's a coherent form of energy that makes the atomic bonds just let go, no matter how hot it does. Keep that in mind when we talk about the Brown's gas torch. Even claims of element transmutation and radioactive reduction. And when we talk about Mark Leclerc's work later this afternoon, we're going to see the same claims. The same phenomena is occurring from plasmoids and from what Mark Leclerc has discovered. So we have clusters coherently combine into a vortex or a vortex ring. They can cascade. Ken Shoulders discovered that. If he takes one EV and uses it to stimulate the next launcher down, he can make a bigger one. In fact, if he lines up the launchers, he can make a centimeter-sized one coming off the end. And he didn't like those. They were too big, too powerful. Whenever they hit a piece of metal in the lab, the EMP that would come off of that would fry his equipment. He didn't want to touch the big ones. It was just too dangerous. And by the way, this makes a perfect unipolar switch where you need to get the energy to propagate down and not reflect back. His biggest energetic discovery is not really well known because he didn't publish it, but he shared it verbally with me. He says when he makes a vortex of water through one of the bore holes, the hole's about 10 microns long, and he shoots one of these EV down through that vortex. There's such a coherent pulse of energy that comes through this, it damages anything that it hits. He couldn't figure out a way to tap it. He said the analogy is like shooting a bullet at a windmill blade. It would just go right through. However, we were brainstorming at the Tesla conference with Jeff Hayes, and he's a big proponent of the Tesla turbine. The Tesla turbine works on the principle of just shooting something through the gap, and the boundary layer makes it go. So maybe a Tesla turbine can tap Shoulders' EV water vortex. So that's kind of an exciting possibility. Any type of larger plasma vortexes can cohere the zero-point energy. It's like we entrain the ether into a vortex form, a coherent form. They see it both in the laboratories, and of course, the nature of your tornadoes. Means that tornadoes themselves, as well as lightning themselves, could cohere the zero-point energy. It could be zero-point energy activators. In fact, anytime you have any type of abrupt plasma discharge, it's likely to have zero-point energy activation. There's inventions made on this principle. These vortex engines, they make a big vortex and they ionize as much as they can. This is the most suppressed invention of all the inventions. These are flat. You hear about them and then boom, they're gone. Energetic clusters can form in inert gases. This is the basis of the PAP engine. The rare earths, great experiment because they don't combine with anything. They don't combust. And yet, when you make a cluster, if you hit them with a laser, they see this in the standard literature. They exhibit this explosive impulse that comes from them. So they're puzzled by that. What's going on? And they show their structure to these clusters. So you make the clusters by hitting it with a lot of voltage spikes. And that was the basis of the PAP engine. I recommend issue 51 of an Energy magazine that's completely dedicated to the PAP engine. PAP had 4 patents, or 3 patents, on the engine. And Russ Griesel covered this later. Basically had some radioactive material to keep the plasma ionized. It wasn't really the source of the energy. But notice when the chamber closes, when the piston closes up, it's carved to make a large vortex ring. So he has these little clusters that are ionized, the plasmoid clusters, and he cascades them to a large one, a very large one. And I think that's the key to really driving the PAP engine. There's been replication attempts. Bob Rohner has presented at the Tesla conference. Daniel Roberts came in and he said, it's easier if we work with like a turbine. We just have to hit them with the blades. But I'm afraid when we make really good EVs being injected, we'll start to put craters on those blades. Russ Grease is here with us at the conference, and so he could be giving a presentation later, so I'll let him cover this. But he started an open source project, and I highly recommend his paper that was an extraordinary Science and Technologists, just came out this year. It was a very thorough paper. Energetic clusters can form in water. The reason I like water, it's the easiest of the experiments. It allows the garage guys to all do it. Everybody can play around with this idea. Peter Gnu had an extremely simple experiment. He's an MIT professor, and he's given talks over this for years. This is from one of his talks. And he was able to photograph the plasmoid film with high-speed photography coming from his chamber. His chamber was very simple, just a small water container. And he would do the abrupt discharge from a capacitor. You know how much energy was on the capacitor. He'd throw the weight up in the air and see how high it goes. He says, well, I'm getting almost force. And he mentioned, oh, I also blow out my bolts. And I said, you're blowing out the bolts? You didn't even measure that? Oh, that wouldn't be conservative. I said, oh my gosh, you didn't even get to where the real energy's at. Excuse me. Gary Johnson at Kansas State University, professor, repeated the experiment, but he designed it so his chamber would blow apart, and he made the spherical weights, a hollow chamber, and then when he did the discharge from the capacitor, they go flying up the guide wires. He could photograph how high they went up, and now he proved there's both an energy anomaly and a force anomaly. And he knows how much input energy he had on the capacitor. And the key thing on these experiments, that the discharge has to be very, very abrupt. If it's not abrupt enough, you just get a normal discharge in water, nothing special happens. But there's a certain threshold that would be hit where all this activity happens. Harold Aspen's written about this for years, about the enormous explosive effects from these pulse ion discharges in water. Here's a website where they want to try to use that as a principle. Well, it's pretty tough. If you're starting down at the water, at the ground state, and we're effectively in these big discharges, making plasmoid in the chamber to blow it apart. Stan Meyer was using this as the basis of his final invention, was the injector plug. There was basically a pulse plasmoid device. He would mix water, ionized air, and rare gas. Here's a top view of it. It's kind of like a little shower head. He put the three things in, and boom, he would give it a big spark, and it would have the anomalous force on the piston. It was a complicated device because they had to pre-ionize the air with the laser. Brown's gas is even simpler still. So we're going to say Brown's gas is just not hydrogen, oxygen, but it's that secondary gas, electrically expanded water or charged water gas clusters. We want to see that the modeling fulfills both. It was a welding application that Yul Brown applied to Brown's gas. That's where you notice the anomalies. The big anomaly is a very cool flame. You can quickly pass your hand through it without burning your hand, a little bit above the boiling point of water. It doesn't even boil water, yet it can vaporize tungsten. Look at that temperature, about 10,000 degrees. This was the big clue. It says not one welding torch can come up to the vaporization temperature of tungsten, and this little tiny Brown's gas torch, it's hardly even hot, can do it. It told me everything. It was the key discovery. I said, holy cow, you got yourselves one of those EVs in there. You're making the same thing that Cone Shoulders was making and observing the same thing. It causes the atoms just to let go. It's not heat that's doing the welding. It's a coherent effect coming from the plasmoids, these EV plasmoids. The anomalies pretty well can cut through anything, claims of element transmutation. We'll get into that when we get to Mark Leclerc's work. The biggie, the cool flame that can sublimate tungsten. It's not addressed in the scientific community. They just ignore this. To me, it's incredible. George Weissman, I credit him for making a discovery called electrically expanded water. He made the announcement in 1996. He said electric shock is observed when the water implodes spontaneously. He's not putting the engine, he just noticed it in storage when it implodes. He'll get an electric shock, and there's some type of liquid crystal structure. He was surmising that. There's been some replication. Ron Mitchell replicated this. When you make the secondary gas, it manifests as fog. That's what you see. Most of the time, this is not happening in the electrolyzers. You get it, but when it's going really, really well, what George Weissman observes in his transparent electrolyzers, he says when it's going really well, there's lots and lots of turbulence going on and a lot of activity, and you start to see the fog coming off. And he thought, oh, I'm making a lot more hydrogen. But I think it's the other way around. It was the turbulence that caused the cavitation to make the secondary gas, and that's why you see a lot more coming off. It manifests as fog. When you see it coming off, fog coming off your electrolyzers, you know you're on track. The water gas is heavier than air. You can fill a balloon. This is a garage guy experiment. Store a balloon for a day or so, vent away all the hydrogen. Balloons can't hold hydrogen very well, and it still exhibits the balloon torch experiment. George says just fill a little water bottle with it and carefully turn it over and take the lid off and let the hydrogen vent away. And then when you spark it, you'll see an imploding ring go down. There's a heavier than air gas stored. That's the secondary gas. It leads to the action item for chemistry departments. Create some Brown's gas, vent away the hydrogen, study the residual gas. Does it burn? Does it still exhibit the Brown's gas torch anomalies? What is that gas? What is its structure? This is straight up chemistry departments. They pretty well have not looked at it except for one. That's Chris Ekman, did it at Idaho State University. And what he did, he found out, gee, it's not diatomic hydrogen, not monatomic hydrogen. It appears to be gaseous water with the excess electrons. And he confirmed the low temperature of the flame and the vaporization of the tungsten. So what we're going to find out, cavitation is the key to making that water gas cluster. Mark LeClaire contacted me in 2011. And it was like a perfect fit. I did not know what the structure was, or what the structure was. It was his work that gave us the key. Creates microscopic craters, carves trenches, even transmuting of elements. And it creates these water clusters, all from his experiment that manifests excess energy. He connected the dots. And this afternoon, we'll talk about his work and his discovery, because if his experimental work repeats, it will change the world because it's so simple. We know about ultrasonics and sonoluminescence. This is a symmetrical bubble collapse. When we hit water with ultrasonics, typically mixed with some inert gas, the bubble collapses symmetrically, and we see a light getting emitted. This bluish light, if it were thermal, would appear to be at a huge temperatures, above 10,000 degrees. It would look, people got excited. It says, if that's thermal, then we can use this for hot fusion. Now, Julian Schwinger, a Nobel Prize winner, said, no, that abrupt compression is cohering to zero-point energy. So we got a Nobel laureate suggesting that in the model. And that abrupt correction is actually, compression actually coheres to zero-point energy and gives it off as light. So the good news is we're getting some zero-point energy cohered. The bad news is we're dissipating as light, and we're really not getting that much in this experiment. However, something happens when the bubble is near a surface or an irregularity. Instead of collapsing symmetrically, it starts to form into a torus. And going through the whole of the donut of the torus is the reentrant jet. And all the energy of that collapsing bubble goes to compress down into that reentrant jet. And there's extreme pressure. So we're going from a micron scale down to a nanometer scale. And under those extreme pressures, about 300,000 psi, we form a solid state of water, a macroionic water crystal. And this was the discovery of Mark LeClaire, an expert on cavitation. And he says these carved trenches, and at the tip of it is what he called a plasma bow shock wave. It's the active where he thinks the zero-point energy coherence. And I says, my gosh, that is identical to Ken Shoulder's EVs. It cemented the deal. He made the same phenomena, except using water. What could be simpler? And so there it is. we'll talk about it this afternoon. It manifests as self-acceleration. Ken Shoulders observed this thing as well. If you let it keep running, it keeps accelerating, accelerating, accelerating. They see a propulsion effect going on. It's like this plasmoid is propelling itself and building up extra energy. And that's how it gets to the transmutation. He has to let it build up its energy first before it strikes the surface to cause the nuclear reactions. Here's a model, we'll talk about it, that he drew. Basically, there's a linear axis of water molecules. In the solid state, the water molecule is actually 180 degrees apart. It's not as traditional because we're in a solid state form at this point. We're a water crystal. And Chris Ekman discovered a little bit of preliminary evidence of linear water with excess electrons. That's what his discovery was. And he realized that would not be stable just as a lone molecule. It would have to participate in some type of cluster to be stable. And where that type of thing happens is Rydberg matter. This is in the standard literature where a number of atoms participate together in a coherent structure where the electrons are way out at the d orbitals. So the electrons are in a high energy state. Okay. This crystal can actually form into loops. And these loops are stable under ½ a micron. And so this is basically the model. The electrically expanded water, we have the electrons out at the d orbitals. The hydrogen likes to hug it. The internal structure has the linear water closing into a loop. So everybody's model is fulfilled. You have the torus form. You have the electrically expanded water. This can polarize. They've seen polarization chains observed because it's flexible. They've observed these bubbles, but they like to hug each other. Andrea Puharch talks about that. A lot of people thought they were hydrogen bubbles, right? But these are actually the water cluster bubbles. And thus, when you take one of those water crystal rings, hit it with abrupt pulse, boom, we make the plasmoid. So many inventors have cavitated the water inadvertently. They didn't mean to, they just end up doing it. Very typical is electrolysis gas in the narrow gaps. The electrodes have a rough surface. Paul Zaguris made them extremely tight gaps. This is hard to do, under a millimeter. He roughened his plates just by sandblasting. He said that very important that that 45-degree angle makes a sharp-lipped crater on the plates. So he was the best at making plates. Could make it well. Here's a picture of a sandblaster. And he would just pull water in from the bottom. He actually made a car to run on it, and out would come the gas. He could just suck the water in, out would come the gas from the electrolyzer. Another way to make turbulence is just blow air through it. Archie Blue did that. Didn't know why, right? But it makes the turbulence and it makes the cavitation. A mechanical vibration, as we pointed out in Massa. He intentionally cavitates by jerking paddles, making them jerk very fast. And he's able to run an engine with no air input at all. He's able to store the gas under pressure because it's not hydrogen, and he allows the storage to leak away the hydrogen. And I highly recommend this video. The white gas smoke is generated, so he sees the fog gas. And Massa is the closest to having a consistent protocol to generate this gas.
東京大田区のプラントメーカー、日本テクノ。日本テクノの大政社長が開発したこの攪拌機。従来のようなプロペラが回転するものではなく、低周波の振動で攪拌する。中の水は安定して循環するという。洗剤を入れても泡が全く立たない。一体なぜか。通常電気分解すると酸素と水素が発生する。しかし大政社長が過去にこの攪拌機を使ってメッキをしたところ、難点とされる大きな泡や水素の爆発が発生しなかった。
振動が伝わっているために表面張力が壊れてですね、泡が形成しようとっても壊れちゃうんですね。だから泡は作りたくても作れない状態がこの現象じゃないかというふうに言われてるんですね。
これをヒントにした大政社長、水に電気を流すと白い煙のようなものが、これは酸水素ガス。 普通の電気分解だと水素と酸素のガスが別々に出てくる。このガスは振動攪拌機でないと得られない。
酸素と水素のガスがですね、元素がナノマイクロバブルになって出るところが従来のですね電気分解と全く違うんですね。そして安全な酸素と水素の私の考えでは結合体のガスが得られると。
水素ガスは分子が細かいため容器などに保存しても漏れやすい。しかしこのガスは2年近く同じ圧力で保存されている。大政社長は酸素と水素2つの分子が結合し特殊な構造を作っているからだと考える。ガスの用途はまずバーナーの燃料だ。温度はおよそ700度で火の中では低い方だが鉄板を切断できるほどのエネルギーに変わるという。さらに新たな用途も生まれようとしている。東京海洋大学の伊藤教授、7月に酸水素ガスを用いてある実験を成功させた。タンクに溜めた酸水素ガスを燃料に小型エンジンを動かすことができた。空気の取り込み口は塞いでいる。ガスの中に酸素があるため燃焼時に空気中の酸素が必要ないからだ。水からできた燃料のため燃焼後はまた水に戻り有害な排ガスは発生しないという。
非常に安定な圧力を加えても爆発しない。インフラとして整備して自由に給油と同じように給ガスができるような状況が作れれば自動車の燃料として置き換わる可能性というのは十分にあって。
ガスの正体を調べようと大政社長は液化を試みた。酸素はマイナス183度、水素はマイナス253度で液化するが、このガスはおよそマイナス178度で液化した。
構造はわからないにしても新しい、地球上でその水の第二の水ができた。エンジンとか発電機だとか今化石燃料に変わるものが水から作れてまた水に戻るというふうに、究極のね、地球を救うね、燃料ですよね。全ての燃料にしたいと。
解明できていない部分が多い酸水素ガスだが大きな可能性を秘めている。
Oscillating fields. Exogen technology was lead engineer Stephen Barry Chambers. Stephen Barry Chambers' sister was Marilyn Chambers, who happened to be the wife of Stan Myers. So after Stan died, she took all the plans to her brother. They founded Exogen. He has 3 patents. They're all the same. And what's unusual about his patent? He did one thing unusual. He puts a toroidal coil under the water. Now, who in their right mind does that? Why would you put an electrical component under the water? But to make a long story short, an oscillating toroidal coil will make an oscillating electric field around it, and if you have charged water clusters, they'll oscillate with it, and in that oscillation they'll create the turbulence, which creates the cavitation. Just do it straight up with ultrasonics. Interesting web article here that says not only do you use an ultrasonic transducer, but use some zinc oxide crystals because that piezoelectric will generate some voltage for you that helps emit a burnable gas that they think is hydrogen. And this came from the University of Wisconsin a couple years ago, that they just some of these piezoelectric crystals in ultrasonic stimulation. So this is a good idea to make that gas. And another improvement is just to sputter the water through the electrolyzer, to go cavitate it and charge it by electrostatic rubbing. This work comes from Provinslick, bubbles and steam electricity. And basically what he describes is thundercloud dynamics. We're mimicking thundercloud dynamics or the dynamics of a Van de Graaff generator. Same type of dynamics. So the still water acts as the dielectric belt, and the rough conductive plates act as the combs. So basically, we can start trying these means of cavitating the water. A sputter of the water across the bottom of the electrolyzer, Use a cavitating pump to circulate the water through the electrolyzers to make a lot more of the clusters. Let the plates vibrate themselves. It's called recavitation, like the reeds of a harmonica. And that would help cavitate the water, just get circulation and vibrate your apparatus. And so the goal is to use these principles to make a self-running system. Self-running system, it's basically you run a gen set, and you let the output from your generator drive the electronics to drive the electrolyzer. 2 teams have claimed success. There are ways to cheat. You can hide alcohol, any hydrocarbons, so you have to make sure you're not cheating. So if you do it yourself, you know you're not cheating. There's chemical reactions that can work with hydrogen, but because they wanted to go open source, they weren't looking for money. I recommend these studying their work because I think these guys were honest. Steve Eaton made an announcement in 2010, self-ran with a generator, a Troy-built generator, and he had some power left over to light the bulbs. Here's his device, very narrow gap, 1/32nd of an inch. He used a spiral line to cause the water and gas to sputter up like a barbershop hole. He found he had a big one. He didn't know about circulation, so he had to make a large one to get the over-unity effect. Oliver and Valentine worked with a very poor generator. This thing might only be 15% efficient. And they worked with a very good cell with fragile gaskets that could vibrate. And that cell is, I think, the trick of why they were successful. And they rode on an elevator for about 8 minutes in a closed-loop fashion. And Stefan Hartman made a really fun video that we'll show at the very end, spicing in the Apple commercial because they think, oh, voila, they made the breakthrough and they're trying to share it with the world. So in wrapping up, zero-point energy exists. It can be it can become an energy source when self-organization occurs, forms the plasmoids, and if you make vortexes of them, you even get more energy coherent. Cavitation makes the reentrant jet, which makes the water crystal that can form into the ring, and then the charged water gas cluster looks like fog. And when we take that cluster and give it an abrupt pulse, we make the plasmoid. And when we have the plasmoids in the internal combustion engine, we make a huge anomalous force that taps the zero-point energy. And our action items, chemistry department, make Brown's gas, remove the hydrogen, what the heck is left? And inventors, make a self-looping system, and then share your information with the world so others can do likewise, because together we will make a new world. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. A couple ads. I've got the cover story of the December issue of Infinite Energy magazine. The books are out there on the table. And this is the website where you can download all the information, every PowerPoint presentation, including this presentation. Just Google water, fuel, ZPE. Thanks again. Oh, yeah. Go ahead and put on Stefan Hartman's film, because it's fun.
How long is that film? I was going to say, can you take a couple questions?
60 seconds.
Okay. Will you take a couple questions after that, Moray?
Sure.
Yeah, we've got a little time.
Well, how come you were rushing me if we had a little time?
Because you have to answer some questions. Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Well, I have two questions. One is, when we were doing this a long time ago, this is like 20 years ago, we started finding when you move the water, weird things happen that made it way, way more efficient. Have they, from what you said here, have they got that down to not quite a science yet where they can get that, like you're saying, the fog every time? Because when we were looking at stuff, we found that maybe 15% of it would be what we called the water gas. It was basically a new form of water, but the rest would be hydrogen and oxygen. With this way, are they getting it like, what percentage of it now is that stuff that isn't hydrogen or oxygen now? What are they able to get up to?
Excellent point. Basically, we don't want to make hydrogen, so what you want to do is cut back the current. Hydrogen proportional to current. You just want high voltage stimulation. So you want to minimize your electrolyte, right? Maximize your turbulence, and maximize your cavitation.
Why don't we go ahead and show this quick film, and then we'll pick up the quick Q&A.
Okay.
Okay?
I guess we can answer questions now.
Questions? Where can we access this presentation? You already said that.
Google Water Fuel ZPE. And the PezWiki site will be the first hit. It'll be under subsequent material.
Okay. We know about cavitation with ultrasonic. You also mentioned you can create cavitation with vibration on the plates of a fuel cell. Yeah.
Okay, that's your question.
No. Can you use audible frequencies to vibrate the plates and cause cavitation?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think you get a little more at ultrasonics, but yes, you can. Definitely.
Okay.
In fact, I think it happens at all different frequencies. The idea is to get the plates to move together.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, she has the microphone.
You were stating that the particular motor they were using that ran for 8 minutes was a very low efficiency motor, like you're getting 15% efficiency. What about using a higher efficiency motor?
Yeah, like Steve Eaton. Duh. Well, they were working on a very low budget. These are like garage guy hobbyists. In fact, they went to all that trouble to jerry-rig the timing. And you just saw in the video. That was a lot of trouble. I personally would recommend spending a little more money.
You're also saying that those high energy, like water bullets, I'm kind of new to this, but water bullets, they said they work better on a turbine, but that will tear up the turbine blades. What about magnetic turbine blades?
Right. This was a Tesla turbine. It doesn't have blades. That was a big thing about the Tesla turbine. Yeah, boundary layers. Good point.
I don't actually need the mic. I can probably just speak up. You mentioned somebody who was creating rough surfaces on their plate before topology. I don't remember who it was, but they said that 45 degrees angle of inclination was important when creating the surface topology. Can you elucidate on why, or do you have any ideas?
Yes. With the craters from the strikes from the silicon carbide, this is microscopically, would end up having very sharp lips on the crater. And when you see cavitating pumps like Griggs does in this patent, he stresses the importance of these sharp lips on the edge of the holes, on the irregularities. And Zagoras just lucked into discovering it.
Thank you.
Oh, another question adjacent.
When you're making the H2O gas and you're getting this fog coming out that you're extracting, what makes you think that that's not
Yeah, well, we'll have to find out what's the temperature of it. On the video of who replicated it, said it was very cool. It was a very cool fog to the touch. So that could be an indication it's not steam.
I have a question about the longitudinal of the Amperian forces, and we have a spark gap that was launching a weight into the air in one of the presentations. There's this thing on Amperian forces and closed loop systems. If you do a high current discharge into an electrode that has another electrode on top, that is in a closed loop system, you observe a lot more matter force, newtons of force, than what Maxwell equations allow for. So I'm curious, with producing hydrogen, is there ways to control that to make the ortho and para hydrogens more efficiently so then you get the exact burn you wish? Like how to actually change the molecules either through electrostatic or electromagnetic interferences, like filters going through there.
Okay, to interpret the question, I'll answer by saying the point of the presentation is we don't want hydrogen, either ortho or para. By the way, ortho and para are very close in its enthalpy. The ortho is a little more. 3/4 of normal hydrogen is ortho, and then 1/4 is para.
It was mainly the dipole. Which direction of changing the dipole orientations?
On the electrodes themselves? Yes. Grinnell's experiment is just straight across. Just pretty simple geometry.
Hey, thanks for being here. Really enjoyed it. If I ran moist air through a 25 kV spark gap, with this click, 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 what would I get?
Well, lightning.
Really? I mean, if you ran that into a car engine, is it going to start getting 90 miles per gallon or what?
I think it'll require a little more than that. We need to get this cluster form. That's my opinion, coming from the cavitation. So if you got an ultrasonic transducer and we've got some of these cluster forms, and then start sparking that, that fog that comes off might get us there. So I'd love to see that as an experiment because it would simplify things all the more. We could get the electrical stimulation out of making the gas and just say it's coming straight from the fog, from the cavitation fog. But we still might need some electrical input because we're polarizing and we're getting the charge to separate on the cluster itself. So it's not clear yet. Nobody's really tried experiments along the lines that I've been suggesting because they all say, no, it's hydrogen. You're not going to tell me any different. And that's how far I get. Right?
I was under the impression that if you start doing cavitation of aluminum, that you would get transmutation of many, many elements across the periodic table, including the ones above 90, which could be radioactive. And if you start playing those games, you could make yourself sick with radioactivity. You didn't touch on that at all that I heard about, or did I miss it?
You didn't miss it. It's happening at 4:30. Mark LeClaire, the inventor. Tune in at 4:30. 10-2.
I think we have time for just one more question. Anybody?
I was wondering if you, if there was a common frequency that was noticed, or if there were common patterns that were noticed at the moment of cavitation. I would suspect they would have something to do with multiples of gold ratio.
Okay, I can address the frequency question. Basically, what Zagoras got the right idea. We're running these things at kilohertz frequencies, very typical in the kilohertz bands with pulsing, and everybody's thinking, oh, that's the resonance of the water molecule itself. It's not. Water molecule's up there at the terahertz band, but at those frequencies, those are very good frequencies for cavitating. And so what they're doing is they're making the entire apparatus mechanically vibrate at those frequencies. And when you have water and gas coming off and everything else, that characteristic frequency tends to change. And what Zagoras did in his electronics, he would keep changing his stimulation frequency to match the mechanical resonance of the whole system. And thus we do have a resonance, but it's not just of the simple water molecule, it's of the entire apparatus.
Moray, thank you. I think that's it. We're out of time, so let's give a big hand to Moray B King.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.